The NAFTA system is roughly 1/3 of the global economy, and it is largely self-sufficient in everything you need to make the global economy work. And the United States has the military capacity to reach out and access raw materials that, for whatever reason, are not produced locally. So let's say lithium. You could easily reach out to places like Argentina and Chile. In a world where everything is based on what you have at home, you tend to not be very sophisticated. So we're looking at a systemic breakdown on two fronts. Demographically, there aren't enough people to consume or produce. And geopolitically, the Americans are leaving the party. And the security that has overwritten everything about globalization is now over. Either one of these is a deal killer, and they're both happening at the same time this decade, right now. The challenge in my work has always been to figure out timeframes. Which block do you pull out of the wall, and how does that affect things? But we're now in a position where at least a half a dozen of the blocks have been pulled out. We are feeling that today as the leading edge of a massive inflationary boom in the United States. Now I said boom. The United States basically has to double the size of its industrial plant in order to make sure that we get the stuff we want. This is a good problem, and it means high growth and high inflation together. Most people are just obsessed about the inflation part right now. They forget that in fixing this, we're going to have some explosive activity. Everything that we're seeing right now in the United States is a problem of strength. And so we can get these weird inflationary and deflationary trends going at the same time. It's going to happen against the backdrop of a currency system that is just becoming singular. We have always thought of the euro as a secondary currency. The idea is that here we've got the world's second largest economic bloc, but the demographic decline there was terminal 2 or 3 decades ago. And now we're reaching the point where Germany and Italy and a number of others are aging into mass retirement this decade. So it was never going to last. But the Russian sanctions have sped it all up. And that gives the United States a population and an infrastructure ballast that a lot of countries don't have, most notably Russia. Russian oil in Siberia is not like Texas. In Texas, if it gets cold, the Texans lose their mind, but the oil production broadly is fine. If you have to shut in a well, it's not like you can't just turn it back on in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. That's fine. It doesn't work that way in the permafrost. As anyone who's from the north understands, as long as you're moving, you're okay, but if you stop, you freeze to death. Same with oil. And oil is co-produced with a lot of water. So we're looking at 4 to 6 million barrels a day of Russian and probably Kazakh crude going away and never coming back. Now, the United States is the world's largest producer of crude and the world's largest exporter of refined product. We will have some arguments over the details because we're American and that's just how it goes. My projection is that the Biden administration will dust off the authority that Congress gave the administration back in 2015 when we first allowed exports of crude. The Biden administration will shut off those exports. That'll trap a lot of shale crude within the United States and force our refineries to retool to process it. That should bring down the cost of most refined products and give the United States a huge amount of energy security by separating ourselves from now a world shortage. But that means that the world loses access to Russian and American crude at the same time. Now, if you're a refiner, at first you're going to bitch because your refineries were not designed to run on American crude. They import the heavy sour stuff from like Canada or Venezuela. And now you're going to have to use this light sweet stuff. But on the backside, 2 years later, when the retooling's done, you're going to be able to sell refined product everywhere and at prices that are just ridiculous. So they'll be the biggest to complain and then the biggest to benefit. For oil, I think we're okay. Let me jump though to the one where we probably are going to have some challenges to make. If you talk about non-food, non-energy commodities, Russia is the world's largest producer writ large, and it falls into a lot of different categories. But the United States does not have a normal steel industry, for example. We are the world's greatest steel recyclers. We use arc furnaces to just take the old steel, turn it into new steel. But if you want something that's pretty, arc furnaces are great if you're making like I-beams and car frames, but if you want to make like appliance cladding or roofing materials, it's kind of ugly. You need fresh steel for that. So what we do is rather than take the iron ore and put it into a blast furnace, then go through multiple rounds of refining to get the final product, we skip that first half. we buy semi-finished products, iron, pig iron, from other countries, and we took that through our high-end process, and we get the highest quality steel in the world with it. But 2/3 of that semi-finished iron comes from Ukraine and Russia. So if we want to avoid some issues with, steel, we need to build a few foundries very quickly.
Right.
That hasn't started yet. And if you want one to really worry about, neon's a fun one. So we use neon to run the lasers that etch semiconductors. Well, 70% of the world's neon comes from the former Soviet Union, and it's a 2-step process. Step 1 is air separation units at those steel foundries that we don't have. And the step 2 process to get the commercial grade neon, the purified stuff, that's done in Ukraine. So not only is the Russian steel offline because of sanctions and boycotts, but that second step, the important step, is all done in Ukraine, and half of that was done in Mariupol, and that facility is now gone. We get to decide in the not too distant future what we don't really need semiconductors for. If we want to rebuild that supply chain, step 1, build the foundry. Step 2, put air separation units in it. Step 3, build that secondary phase. There's no way you do that in less than 3 years. I would love for the government to take an active role in that. I'm not convinced it's going to happen. And this isn't necessarily a criticism of the Biden administration, although if you interpret it that way, you'd not be wrong. But we haven't had to have a national economic policy in this country since World War II. We're not good at that sort of planning. We let the market do its thing. And in a globalized world, we've moved up the value-added chain, and a lot of those lower quality steps we have allowed other countries to do because they can do it more cheaply until the supply chain system breaks down. And now, out of a sense of necessity, it's got to come back. Now, in that, we have some advantages over all the other developed countries of the world. Courtesy of the shale revolution and the fact we have so much elbow room, the development costs for what are normally low value-added products here are already the cheapest on the planet. Shale revolution has kept our electricity and our plastics and our natural gas prices low. Our petrochemicals costs are the lowest in the world. So we can do the high value-added stuff on the back end with our high-end labor and our instrumentation. But we can also do the stuff that normally elsewhere in the world is done by low value-added economies, the heavy industry stuff. It's the part in the middle where it gets a little bit messy. Enter Mexico. Mexico is highly efficient in terms of output per worker hours. They've been just going like this now for 20 years. And they're more competitive than